Hello and welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. This is your host, Captain Kibbs, signing on today, and today we're going to be talking about the Ares Conventions. Now, the Ares Conventions, for those of you who don't know in the Battletech lore, is basically a rules of engagement kind of document. It's weird. It's like it's a document that, basically every nation signs. It's very similar to the Geneva Conventions, except it's more so for conduct of warfare. It's very different, and it's also much like the Geneva Conventions for third world countries, and in this case, for the great major powers, is often ignored at will. Now, it was dreamed up by a lady by the name of Alicia Liao. She was obviously of House Liao, and she was the leader of the Capellan Confederation during the Age of War. And a little bit of a background about the Age of War. The Age of War refers to a period in time right after the collapse of the Terran Alliance, in which all the factions began vying for power. All the major houses were being formed, and this series of unending wars continued and continued and continued. There was tons of little wars everywhere that were happening, and this is before the HPG network existed. So things were very different back then. As in, to attack a planet, you had to jump in, and no one on that planet or system would know about the attack until a ship was able to jump out and inform the next ship. And basically what you had was a ferry of jump ships used as a sort of communication network for each empire. Now, most instances when a world would come under attack, it would more than likely fall because the response time for reinforcements to be assembled would take way too long. By that time, the system would already be under the other person's control. So you had very weird sorts of warfare where territory was swapping hands very easily, and things were kind of mobile in the sense that nobody really knew where anyone was because information traveling took forever in this universe, or in this time point in particular. Now, back on the subject of the Ares Convention. The Ares Convention came about because in one of these instances, when the Free Worlds League, which uncommonly suffers from an apparatus of, issues in its own accord in terms of communication, in one instance they invaded the Capellan Confederation, and they didn't quite establish rules of engagement. And these kind of instances have happened in the past before. And in this instance, the lack of knowledge about the rules of engagement basically dictated that any person sighted is a hostile target and therefore must be engaged. If you can't see their hands, you just open fire. And that would go for, you see a person in a building, right? You see one in the window, you just open fire on that structure. They open fire and they blow up the building because due to their doctrine during that engagement was set to engage everything. And so it ended up in a total massacre. So bad was this massacre that, in fact, Alicia Liao was deeply affected by it, which was the current chancellor of the Capellan Confederation, and she was a huge advocate for peace. That's one of the important things. One of the few high lords, if you will, that have ever been so, avoiding of conflict. She dreamed up this thing called the Ares Convention, in which she invited all these people. Well, it wasn't called the Ares Convention when she dreamt it up. It just so happened that the planet that they, signed the convention was on a planet named Ares. Thus, the name Ares Convention. Ironic, and, in a weird kind of sense. And it's also ironic because it's often ignored, and its purposes have only helped to legalize warfare, but on a more controlled manner. And again, this is during the Age of War. You'd see the First Succession War, the Second Succession War, wars where they'd throw out the Ares Convention that they were so devastating that, these kinds of things would be going ignored. It's kind of the great hypocrisy in the universe is there's so many good people that try to create good things, and yet so little comes out of it due to all the, different people in different instances. Battletech is a universe filled with good and a universe filled with evil on all sides. You have the Capellan Confederation at one point being the good guys, or the morally more good guys, I guess, in terms of Western ideals and values, and then next minute they're doing the exact opposite. This kind of stuff you see reoccur in different periods. Like, for instance, one of my favorite factions, House Davion, does the same sort of thing. Like, they're pretty much like a little bit conquest-like, especially to the minor periphery states. But back on the subject of the Ares Convention, we're going to go through it article by article, including the preamble. So it's going to be a lot of reading out of it, because I figured instead of just commenting, we'll comment on the articles, but I'll read them for your sake as well. And one other thing, before we delve into this, there is a link in the description to where you can actually pick up the Age of War book, because it took me a while to find a lot of information about this particular era, because it's technically before the Star League, and it's still in that sort of pre-lore where there's not a lot of stuff, because generally speaking, there's not a lot of mechs in this war. Only towards the end, when the Terran hegemony invent mechs, do mechs become prevalent. So you have a lot of instances where, it's just tanks, infantry, conventional means, aircraft, the usual stuff. And towards the latter stages of the Age of War, which, by the way, is a series of war. And one other thing important to note, the Age of War isn't actually as bad as it sounds. Like, it sounds like, fucking colossal, Titanic, right? Throughout all of the wars in the Age of War, less people died than they did in World War II. And this has to do with a couple of factors. One important factor we need to mention is that this is still early onto humanity's expansion outwards in the ever-growing sphere. So people haven't really populated these worlds that much. Bear in mind that, 700 years later, or sort of where we are now in the current lore, that's been almost 1,000 years now. People have bred and, quite frivolously, so there's a lot more people now. Back in this point, there was less people, and combat was a lot more difficult to do. It wasn't something that happened frequently, because setting up attacks were, it took a while. And that's, again, why you didn't see communication lines established without the HPG. Wars were messy, because it relied on that communication chain. But to get into the Ares Convention without dilly-dallying too much further into it, which, by the way, we'll have to make character bio lores on like a character like Alicia Liao, because there's a lot of interesting stuff about her. I have a bunch of custom art that you're going to be looking at. All the art, by the way, you're seeing is custom made just for this video. Pretty fucking awesome. So either way, the preamble. We, the undersigned, on the 13th day of June 2412, in accordance with our commitment to preserving human life, do solemnly pledge to prevent the loss of civilian life in war. Let this document testify to our desire to end the senseless atrocities attendant upon human conflict, and our pledge to uphold the ideals contained within these conventions, or suffer the harshest consequences. The conventions were signed by Director General Judith Cameron, Terran Hegemony. Paul Davion, representing the first Prince Edmund of Davion of the Federated Sons, Council Heather Durant of the Rimworld's Republic, Adam Kirita, for the Principality of Razelhog, Coordinator Robert Carita, Draconis Combine, Chancellor Alicia Liao, Capellan Confederation, Captain General Peter Merrick of the Free Worlds League, and Archon Catherine Steiner of the Lyran Commonwealth. Absent are the signatures of Admiral Sigur Fon, Regent of the Astrian Conclave, and Maharaja Naval Patel of the United Hindu Collective. They don't exist anymore, but they were a nation at one point. They got absorbed. The former distrusted the Capellan Confederation's intentions, and the latter recognized Ares Conventions as a legitimization of warfare. End. So that is the preamble. Basically, it's all the people who signed. There were a couple of people who didn't sign, and that's a whole other reason why they didn't. For one instance, we can talk about the Free Principality of Razelhog, which isn't really free. It's more like a puppet state of the Draconis Combine. They allowed them the honor to sign it as a relatively independent-ish nation. That was a big deal for them, by the way. And the other nations were a lot more skeptical, such as, the Hindu Collective, as well as the, God, why does their name always escape me at the last fucking second? The guys in the bottom right. I always think the bottom right of the map, right? Oh, goodness gracious. Hold on a moment while I have a brain spasm just to fucking figure out who the hell I was talking about. Oh, my God. That's terrible. It just slipped my mind. Either way. They're next to the Capellan Confederation. Why does this happen? We're not doing any editing. I'm trying something completely new. This is me talking about the lore from memory and everything. So this is an example of something slipping your fucking mind right at the last fucking second. The Astrian Conclave. I was thinking like cows for some reason. The Astrian Conclave also didn't sign. And that has to do with the fact that they're extraordinarily distrustful, especially considering how many times they have previously trusted any of the great houses and were very quickly backstabbed. So they have a huge distrust, and this already shows the distrust between the periphery realms and the inner sphere powers, which I always think is a cool sort of play on the politics in this universe. All right, now we get to delve into the juicy stuff, and I think there's about, if I remember right, memory serves me, 18 or so articles about this fucking nonsense of rules that will be often ignored, so let us delve into the first article. Nuclear arms, also the most important one, because they use these abundantly. The use of any nuclear device or variant thereof on a planetary surface or against any commercial vessel is prohibited. This prohibition extends to tactical nuclear blasts against the aforementioned targets. Controlled nuclear attacks in space against military targets are prohibited unless they occur at a minimum distance of 75,000 kilometers from the surface of any inhabited world in the star system. Violations of this article between signatory states were uncommon, but the Taurian Concordat suffered greatly from strategic nuclear strikes during the Rim War, which is, very painful for the poor bastards. Poor fuckers. They get fucked relatively often, by the way. So, if anyone ever wonders, if you're ever doing the role play, why you make your Taurian characters, very distrustful and most periphery, it's reasons like this instance where they get fucking like, sure. Trust them, and then bam, right in the face. Tactical weapons were used most commonly between the Lyran Commonwealth and the Draconis Combine. Their use was unusual enough between Capellan Confederation and Federated Suns to allow those states to sign a further pact banning their use in 2546. You're going to see a lot of dates referenced in this article because it's, different periods where they are adding appendixes and all sorts of other shit. The second article, in regards to orbital bombardment, says, the use of orbital assets to bombard stationary targets as defined in Appendix B, Section 4, which we'll get to that in a bit, on a planetary surface. Oh god, this is a full-blown legal document, by the way. Planetary surface with the single exception of a valid military objective, whose destruction the attacker deems necessary to ensure the survival of his own troops, is prohibited. In no case may any orbital attack take place in or near heavily populated areas. There's a couple of spelling errors there. And any orbital attack is subject to ex post facto review by a duly appointed council from the signatory states. Artillery wasn't employed much during the Age of War. Artillery. Haha, that's what they call it? What the fuck? Stop that. That's cancerous. Orbital artillery. Or artillery. Oh, there's a reason why I normally just fucking make up my own words sometimes. Okay. This is an example. Artillery. Oh, God, cringe. Wasn't employed much during the Age of War. It was often far more effective as a threat than in actual use. Thus, this article was rarely violated. So yeah, it was never really violated that much. One little thing is the clan invasions. You'll see this heavily violated, as well as in the Jihad era, as well as in the First Succession War, specifically that one in particular. Orbital bombardments with nuclear weapons, so violations of Article 1 and 2 at the same fucking time. That's what I fucking thought. So many worlds were lost that way. God damn, so many. Alright, so, Article 3. Surrender to lessen the human cost of warfare. Or Article 3, in reference to surrender. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. To lessen the human cost of warfare, all combatants must accept the surrender of any unit that offers it. A white flag adorned with a red S will represent the universal surrender standard, so that any unit unable to communicate by conventional methods may still surrender fairly. The Universal Surrender Guidelines in Appendix E outline the provisions for the treatment of the prisoners, fair compensation for capturing forces upon the release of war prisoners to their native realms. The treatment of prisoners was subject to great variations, this being one of the bad ones in Draconis Combine. There are recorded instances of entire units disappearing altogether after a losing engagement, but this was very rare. The opportunity to ransom an already defeated opponent was just too lucrative for most states, and so most surrendered units survived in good condition. Yes, generally speaking, in this universe you'd see a lot of surrendered units survive how you'd sort of see them in medieval. They would be ransomed. However, the ransoms weren't paid, and in most cases they were, because they'd also purchased the equipment back. So it's kind of weird, because warfare is working in a very controlled sense. You can kind of feel how we've already gotten through 3 articles and how this is going to only perpetuate war rather than stop it. It will, however, lessen civilian casualties when people follow the articles, but that happens very rarely. And again, if you can get away with something like, let's say, hiring a mercenary company to go and nuke something for you, and or a sneaky team, or under the guise of terrorists, and using chemical weapons and biological warfare, that happens so often, it's hilarious. I mean, sure, the other great houses will, be like, hey, faggot, you did that. And then sometimes Comstar in the later stages, or the other various factions, will, interdict a little bit and, put up some embargoes and be like, no, stop, don't do that. But very rarely, and only when it got really bad. Dracona's Combine, referencing of the Kentauri's massacre and the First Succession War. Sick fuckers. Those poor fucking Davions did not deserve to be fucking gunning down children and just cutting up fucking... Not even gunning down children, burning them alive. Jesus. It was a dark time, but that Kentauri's massacre is for a later date. That's another example of another violation. It's a rule book of wars that the universe ignores, but it also makes sense in a kind of a cool yet sad, poetic way. Article 4, and this is in regards to safe passage. The governments and military commands of the undersigned agree to recognize the aforementioned white flag as a symbol of truce. Any vessel or vehicle or person bearing such a truce flag shall be granted safe passage through any place insofar as the bearer breaks no laws pertaining to that place or initiates no hostile activity of any kind. Ooh, that was a handful. Should the bearer of a truce flag engage in hostile activity as defined in Appendix F, the truce flag shall be deemed invalid, and any action taken against the individual or individuals becomes the responsibility of those suffering said action. Harassment of a truce flag bearer without provocation will be investigated by a duly appointed board of inquiry from the signatory states. This includes all the great houses. This is an attempt by Miss Alicia Liao to encourage the houses to, pick at each other. She was trying to use that sort of conflict between the other great houses that they'd all fucking dogpile that one the minute he did something. That was her hope. Her hope was, by creating this document, by making them forcibly work together, they all sign it, and it was a popular opinion when she presented this that people throughout this sphere and beyond were like, hell yes, I'd rather not be blown up randomly, which they still do get anyways, would sign it and, enforce it because they wouldn't want other people, quote-unquote, cheating. But again, they get away with it anyways, and all good intentions in the Battletech universe normally end with tragic failures. Now, that's Article 4. Article 4 is the sad one. Well, no, Article 4 is... it's not too violated. The ancient Red Cross and the Crescent were considered acceptable substitutes for the Red S, for the medics and their vehicles. So yes, those are also considered okay not to shoot, I mean. So if you have Red Cross, the Crescent, they wouldn't fire on those because they're medical vehicles or things like that. And that had to do with the fact that during the Age of War, there was a children's hospital when the Free Worlds League invaded the Capellan Confederation, in which a bunch of militants fled into. And again, according to the rules of engagement, the troops aren't at fault because they followed the command. The command was to engage. And it's also a fault on the Capellan Confederation troops for running into the hospital to begin with. And so that forced the Free Worlds League hand, once they were engaged, to return fire. And it was heart-wrenching because there were, it's a children's hospital, it's filled with children, and in wartime that's where they were all hunkered down. And so when the militants fled in there because they were panicking and they were routing, and then they began returning fire, it was the one instant that really sparked Alicia's, her Führer in this, her wish to Führer, der Führermeister, her fury in getting this document made and getting this to happen, because she was never an advocate for war. She wanted peace. That was always the thing she wanted. And fun fact is, she even made compromises for contested territories. She allowed the Free Worlds League to rule over territories they had claim on in order to get peace, but also, at the same time, after a duration was a decade, they could take a vote on whether they wanted to stay with the Free Worlds League or move back to the Capellan Federation. And actually, in most cases, most of these worlds actually went back to the Capellan Confederation because they were actually Capellan territories. So, Merrick kind of got his hands tied behind his back because he looked like a complete bastard annexing territories that don't rightfully belong to them. A lot of territories in this universe that are vied for are border territories that have disputes of different populations and such like that. The only major conflicts you see pushed are things like, succession wars, period wars, or wars that are trying to reclaim the first lordship throne on Terra to become the new Lord of the Stars, pretty much. And that's one of the things you see frequently happen. throughout the Succession Wars era. But that's more so for a later date. And that's why you see engagements, annexing tons of territories. Now, if a great house can get away with it, they will annex an entire house if possible. I mean, to a degree. The Razzlehog Republic has its own, the Free Principality of Razzlehog has its own, populace and sort of power, kind of, but it is very much a puppet state of the Draconis Combine, while some of its other territories are also under the control of the, Steiner cunts. the big tittied Steiners. You got the big tittied Steiners, the weeaboo fucking Drax, and the goddamn FLW, or FWLs, the Free Worlds League, fucking tank lollies. God damn. This universe is a very special universe when you start attributing these things to it. Now, on to Article 5. This one's a fun one. Everyone loves the Article 5, because Article 5 is inherently, innately bad. It's urban warfare restrictions. Article 5. No battle shall be waged in an urban area, except under extreme circumstances. If the military objective of an assault lies in a city center, attacking troops must ensure that any hostile action taken causes the least possible amount of collateral damage. No attack may be made against any civilian target for any reason. Civilian targets shall be deemed to include such life-supporting equipment as water and air purifiers and agricultural assets, or any other item that enables the planet's population to continue their existence. You'd see that ignored in the first Succession War, as they, bombarded entire population centers, and in other instances as well. Surprisingly, this article was not often violated during the Age of War, and that makes sense because, again, there wasn't a whole need to do the extermination of population centers, because they're again trying to incorporate what little populations existed in that universe. Because at this point, there's not that many people around, and people need to fuck more and make more little people so they can get more taxes. Sad. Urban combat is extremely bloody for the attacker and defender alike. So set pieces, chess-like battles in a park outside limit cities are often commonplace. So yeah, you'd see combat take place outside of cities. If you have urban combat happening, shit's fucked up, and it's a hell. I mean, you've got warfare raging all over the fucking place if a city's under attack. And you'd see the clanners completely ignore this, and even according to their codes of honor, obliterate entirely undefended populations and still call it honorable. So much for fucking honor. Because fucking clanners, let me fucking tell you, selective honor is how I like to put those fuckers. Okay. Article 6, Chemical and Biological Warfare. The best one. The best article ever. Because chemical and biological agents kill human life indiscriminately and often permanently damage the biosphere of any world suffering such an attack, as we saw in the first Succession War in particular. The use of further development and production of such agents are strictly prohibited. And we'd see them return, new ones, in the fucking Jihad era, when the Blakeists, began their great war, their great crusade against everyone and everything that wasn't them. Oh, God. It's funny. It's funny because of, how ignored some of these ones are. It's that one is relatively ignored by the Great Houses. Even the Great Houses are not big fans. But you'll have factions who are yeah, biological warfare. I mean, you got to play dirty if you want to play with the big boys. It's the only way you're going to be able to, compete. While few states employed biological agents during the Age of War, chemical weapons were deployed during the Rim War. Poor fucking periphery states. Every state continued to secretly develop new strains and formulations of. Some cynical historians have suggested, like myself, that it was a Terran hegemony research in this field. So yeah, no, the Terran hegemony actually pushed a lot of research bounds. And remember, the Terran hegemony sits at the center. They're the most important faction because they're the most innovative and most technologically advanced in the Battletech universe. In fact, the Star League's equipment is Terran hegemony tech. That's one important thing to bear in mind. The Terran hegemony, most economically powerful and most technologically powerful. And Terra to this day, even after all the things that happened, remains a technological beacon. Even during, the Jihad, when, nuked their own planet again. Because Terra getting nuked and chemical warfare is, almost a fucking common state. You'd think that'd be the safe place. I guess one thing I should say, I've wanted to say for a while, is equate Terra to the Constantinople in our history. Terra is very much that way after the fall of the Star League. Hell, you could almost consider the Star League fall of the Roman Empire, kind of. Not really. I mean, it's very different, but it's similar mindset. A lot of technology would survive near the inner worlds of the Terran hegemony, and those worlds that were ones that were brutally fought over to be taken away. One like Dallas. Dallas was one of the most strong points during the fall of that. Oh, it deserves its own video. Dallas is a particular world of interest, just on its last stand and how brutally fucked that house or that fucking world got after the collapse of the Star League. So that's wrapping up the Article 6 there. Now, we're going to move on to the Appendices. The original treaty proposed by Miss Alicia ran to 80 densely packed pages. After months of negotiations, the expanded Appendices pushed to a total of over 320 pages. So it's, I mean, by legal document standards, it's not that much, but this is also bearing in mind that these are 320 pages dictating how warfare is to be conducted. So you have a very interesting thing going on here. As such, they are far too lengthy to reproduce at full length, and they're also merely summarized. And that's also their lazy excuse for not actually having them all written out, because I can't find anywhere. The Age of War book, and I think there's one other source I'll link in the description if I can find it again, is the only place I can find where it goes in depth into the details of the Ares Convention. So it doesn't even have all the information. And sadly, it's only got like 2 pages out of 320. We're missing some. Either way. So, moving on to the Appendix A. Appendix A. This section rigorously defined combat forces. It included strict definitions of infantry, armor, artillery, cavalry, and so on. Aerospace forces were also covered in some detail, as the battle mech had not yet been invented. Mech forces were covered instead by the amendment of 2465. Like the Geneva Conventions of the 20th century, for a person to be considered as a combatant and thus subject to the protections of the treaty, he or she had to be in uniform when engaged, much like the Geneva. In action, the closing section of this appendix, then went into great detail to give allowances and exceptions to exactly what a uniform entailed and when it should be worn in combat. So, yeah, if you're not in uniform, and remember, because mech warriors, because of like riding on a fucking fusion core and it's fucking hot in there, they don't wear much. So the guys and the gals in there, they're pretty naked. And in some cases, I think they're actually naked, because it gets so hot in there. Well, they're not entirely naked. They wear the cooling suit jacket, depending on how much they have, and in different eras less of it, because there's not as much shit, but you know, which basically just flushes coolant around in their body, just so they stay cool, and to try to keep them from, you know, getting too hot and fucking their own body shutting down. Or, you know, in some instances though, if it gets that hot, if they catch on fire, you know, that happens. And when they burst on fire, the coolant jacket doesn't do much, except I think it almost, at that point, is just fucking burning too. But, yeah, that's that. Now, on to Appendix B. This chapter went into detail on acceptable targets for military action. Its first 3 sections covered mobile assets, military units, and their supported and transportation. Later sections covered fixed defenses, transportation hubs, depots, military bases, and barracks headquarters, buildings, and spaceports. So, just basically, you know, don't blow those up, because, you know, there's only so many of them existing in certain eras. Oh, sadness. Oh, goddamn. Appendices C and D. These are basically rough summarizations of the fucking Ares Convention, because they didn't want to write it all out. And the Age of War book is actually fucking like only like 30 pages. It's fucking tiny. And it's the only real fleshed out document on this era, which is a bit of a shame. I'd honestly like to see them explore it more, because it's warfare in the Battletech universe, but before mechs, and then very early when mechs were introduced. So you had a lot more tanks, even when the mechs were introduced. Lots more infantry and conventional warfare. It's a completely different flavor in how you play an Age of War battle versus any of the other ones. More traditional, I guess you can say. Appendices C and D. With military forces and targets so rigidly specified in the various leaders and diplomats, then felt it necessary to precisely define civilian populations and assets. Anybody that didn't fit into either the military or civilian definitions was labeled a pirate, and therefore could be engaged. It did not take long for the number of pirate bands to increase dramatically along contested borders. Considering how they interpret them. Such forces were used as the ultimate and deniable assets, and their employment lasted well into the succession wars. You can understand why. Appendix E. While Article 3 stated that this appendix merely outlined guidelines for the proper surrender and treatment of forces, it actually went into some detail as to the properties of the situation. Surrenderers had to be accepted, and provisions had to be made for the ethical housing and care of the individuals and forces that had given up the fight. Officers would be granted their parole, while enlisted men could only expect to be imprisoned, though often in better surroundings than their own home barracks. So sometimes you would actually see better treatment because, again, you'd see better treatment of prisoners in some instances because it played at the politics. And these houses, played the people's hearts. A lot of these nobles did, because in this universe, while it is a neo-feudalistic society, at the same time, people have a lot more power than they did in the medieval times, and a lot more people know about it because you have news agencies. And while some of these news agencies are heavily propagandized, it gets out. The word gets out. And one of my favorite examples is the Centauri's Massacre. I'm going to bring it up again because it's important. Despite the Draconis Combine having one of the most strictest medias in fucking human history, more strict than CNN, Jesus Christ, the news of the massacre still got out, and their own populations were like, holy shit, we did that. That ruined their whole justified, Bushido code, at least how noble they thought themselves for at least a few decades until they forgot it. But, that's how it normally goes. And the worst part about that is it's not even one of the worst massacres. The Centauri's is mostly popular, is one of the more popular ones, but there's been entire world genocides. But those don't get any media attention because, again, you didn't get to see the cameras live up and close. You just saw desolated worlds from orbit. So it was haunting, but it wasn't, it was far from home. It didn't hit close to home. And when you had cameras up and close, witnessing these atrocities, damn, did it strike home. Could you imagine? Just watching children get torched and old people get fucking hacked down with the katana. Because that's what they were fucking doing. They were sick bastards. Even their own troops started to break. But that is, again, delving too much into that. It's a very powerful moment and a very defining moment in the Succession Wars. Let me just say that much. All right. Appendices F, G, and H. These 3 chapters, which are not going to be explained upon and are only going to be instead a paragraph, define the exact nature of military force in ground combat. F, space sections. G, special force strikes. H, they were also known as the hostile action appendices due to their repeated use of the term. In all cases, they were attempted to limit open conflict as much as possible. Commanders were encouraged to resolve battles through proxy. Some went so far to challenge their opponents to sports matches or simulation event games even. So not even anybody would really die in these cases. Impossibly. And that's actually happened. But one-on-one duels or small unit actions were far more common. So you'd see that happen a lot more. And you see that in the Battletech game, actually, where they instead duel for the fate of a nation, or they duel for that. Because, again, this helped encourage the peer system. See, this toppled with the peer system that the Camerons would introduce later on would fucking encourage that mindset of nobility, honor, and dueling. That would make it, it would be a more, I guess, political act. You'd still have massive battles take place, but it disencourages those massive battles for more lance on lance or mech on mech, more duel based, and that's why you see it in a very sort of gets that neo-feudalism going. That neo-feudalist, I guess, you get a neo-feudalistic vibe, and then as the eras go on, you get a fucking cyberpunk vibe on top of that. That is basically Battletech for you. It should be noted that the proxy battles were only a suggestion, not a rule. By the conventions, it was acceptable to use one's entire force to accomplish military objectives, as long as the campaign was otherwise conducted according to the other articles and appendices, which sometimes would be ignored. And the clanners, let me tell you, would ignore this fucking frequently. In fact, they don't even follow the Ares Convention. They follow their own little honor thing. Despite them, having the Ares Convention before they even went on the Exodus. But that got thrown out really quickly in Operation Klondike, which is another fucking thing. Appendices I through L. Each of these sections discussed a different type of weapon of mass destruction. Appendix 1 dealt with atomic arms, not one. Atomic arms. J with radiological or dirty bombs. K with chemical, and L with biological agents. The definitions and restrictions were so strict that even comparatively innocuous chemicals such as tear gas could not be employed legally, but they would be anyways, at least against a foreign power's troops. And you'd see them used during the Star League's suppression of the poor little periphery states. They used tear gas quite frequently to try to calm the little ranxious little fucking mobs of people. And that didn't really work, but that happened. Appendices M through O. These 3 chapters covered various boards of inquiry and investigative commissions, can't speak today, to look into violations of the other agreements. Because the great houses distrusted each other so vehemently, I can never pronounce that word correctly, it often fell to the Terran hegemony to provide a neutral third party. Oh god, here, now I get to elaborate on that. Fucking kill me. Third party for such matters. The hegemony typically used these to further its own interests, directly culminating in these talks themselves, the Capellan Confederation and the Free Worlds League that led to the creation of the Star League. So yes, in the Age of War, specifically this period, the Terran hegemony was always at the center mitigating these things, because they actually reversed their conquest things during the McKennas, and when the Camerons came into power in the hegemony, they became more the brokers of peace, relatively. Though they did do some conquesty things, testing out their Battletechs and regaining a few of their lost core worlds, because quite a few of the core worlds were lost during the collapse of the Terran Alliance, and untoppled by McKenna's, one of the McKenna's fucking failings. But they were able to reclaim their own, natural border size of the Terran hegemony. But either way, that sort of helped the Terran hegemony broker things. They peacefully brokered things to manipulate things so that they became the center. They became the center to go to for diplomacy. They became the center to go through for technology. They became the economic center as well. They made themselves the heart of a nation that hadn't been born yet. And every great house began, relying on them for things more and more. And that's what helped it easily create the Star League. And especially when you had, the Free Worlds League and the Capellan Federation joined, and then eventually the Steiners, bam, you've got half the sphere. And the other half is, has its own problems. And we'll get to that in their own lore, because why did the House Davian didn't join? Because House Davian, they're just really cool. Gotta mention it. So House Davian didn't originally join the Free Worlds League because they wanted to go in with their heads high and their shoulders high. And their back straight, because they were in a civil war, and the civil war, if they went to the Star League for help during the Civil War, it would have looked like they were begging, broken and weak, and even afterwards. So they were like, no, we'll join, but we're going to enter as a contributing member of the League. We do not want to rely on the Drax or the feds. We want to be our own thing. We want to be, strong, independent, even though they're part of this, and honorable as well. That's a big thing. Appendices P and Q. These 2 appendices were filled with further definitions of many terms used throughout the conventions, and a series of direct translations into languages other than English. The Appendix P concentrated, fucking kill me, on translating concepts of Chinese and Japanese, while Appendix Q did not the same for French, German, Spanish, Swedish, and Arabic, and Hindi. While generally excellent throughout, the Hindi translations were quite poor, using Sinhala characters, which I know nothing about, rather than the proper Devangari, which I'm probably butchering those pronunciations, but fuck you guys and fuck myself for questioning otherwise. This made the section incomprehensible to most readers, which, bad, and may have been a factor in the United Hindu Collective rejecting the Aries Convention. They're like reading the document, right? And they're like, what the fuck does this say? I do not blame them for not wanting to translate or not wanting to join or become a signatory if they had no idea. It's one of those oversights that, they weren't looked at as a major power, and so the other houses didn't really worry about them too much. So they just kind of ignored them, and again, they got absorbed anyways. Appendix R. Seemingly added as an afterthought, this short and rather bland section outlined allowable usages of spies and other intelligence operations. However, once one sorts through the confusing language and obfuscating, God kill me, phrasing, it's clear that it only bans outright assassinations, and all other matters of espionage. It was a business as usual for the inner sphere powers. and people still got fucking assassinated. Don't worry about it. Ugh, kill me right now. Okay, we're going to briefly talk about the Addendums, and then there's... actually not anymore. There's not... It's only 2 pages, that's sad. The Addendums. Only 2 additions were approved after the Ares Convention were signed into First Treaty. The Addendum of 2465 was proposed by the Terran hegemony and added battle mechs and as an allowable combat force type. The original signatory states all ratified this over the next few years, as they got their own tech. The Director Generals were patient. If a particular House Lord was resistant to the overtures, then they would simply wait for other powers to take. As it turned out, the last holdout was the Draconis Combine. Signed the Addendum in 2472. Look at those little Dracs dragging their fucking asses as usual. Jesus Christ. It's fucking in character, I guess. The second Addendum was passed on the eve of the Reunification Wars. So that's when they finally got all their shit together. Yay! It did not require ratification by the states, as they had already given over the power to the Star League, and so the other bureaus and shit could fucking do it for them. Dummies. It simply rescinded the Ares Conventions. They were never passed back into law. So yeah, that sums up the Ares Convention. And then we'll have to do character bios, because Alicia Liao is a very, very, very important character in the terms of its conception. She was the big pusher for this, and then Ian Cameron also was in on this. He was like, yeah, no, I want this too. I'm wondering why, though, but I think we can all guess as to why. Either way, that concludes the Ares Convention, and that's a brief look into the Age of War, and we're going to be going more into detail, and I'll be trying my best to gather what little information I can from various sources, because, again, this document is way too small, and it's a little bit pricey. I'll send you a link for it, but it adds a few units, and it's got a couple of the other things, but it's only about 27-ish pages of content, and then there's some character sheets and stuff for vehicles that it adds. But yeah, no, it's too short. It's too short. And in such a volatile era in terms of politics, and a defining era of shaping the neo-feudalistic societies and the cyberpunk-esque vibes you get from this universe, it's missing that expanding. I'm hoping that now that they're reviving Battletech, we can see this Age of War section of the lore expanded upon. I want the Age of War expanded upon, and the Terran Alliance, as well as the Western Terran Alliance, and that back lore. It needs more fleshing out. There's stuff on it, but there's not enough information on what could be a really interesting point in the lore of how it defines and shapes the universe as it, how it became so weird as it is now and interesting. Either way, if you liked this video, I would appreciate you guys letting me know your feedback in the comments. We're going to be doing more lore as usual. It'll be a little bit slowed down because we are working on our game, and that's requiring a lot of time in terms of development and stuff. So I'm fucking overloaded to the max, but I'll be pumping out as much as I can, when I can, getting you guys everything I can. For those of you who have supported the channel by joining, there's going to be a link in the description as well to that as well. If you want to support our channel, you can donate. It's $5 a month. That helps us in terms of artists. So the artists you see here also have linked in the description. Thanks to their fantastic artwork, we were able to put this together. And thanks to their fantastic artwork, we can put our game together as well. So any money that you guys donate there goes strictly to that fund to support them, to keep the art coming, to keep these being produced in this quality. Even if that doesn't come through, don't worry about it. I'll put it together. I'll just have to use the pre-made assets, the already existing artwork. I think it would be really cool if we could one day get to a point where we could have all of it. Well, it is all of it now. All of the pieces we have now. Custom assets all the time. Every lore video, everything we do, custom assets. No other assets. All of it original. It's such a spectacular thing. Either way, I thank you those of the... rolling my words because I've spoken so much. I thank all of you guys who've supported us that far. It does mean a great deal to myself and the rest of the team. We love it. We couldn't do it without you guys, and with your support, we've been able to come quite a ways. But without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have yourself a great weekend. Until next time, we'll see you in the next lore video. Captain Kibbs, signing off.